Charter cities are a catalyst to a stagnant region where the choice of development stands fulfilled. Essentially, what do we stand in opening government? The first is understanding how does this economically failing cities look like and why exactly are they in this particular situation? Three reasons. The first is probably there's already a huge corruption level within this particular context, which means there's probably lesser development that happens within that particular area. But the second thing probably is that there's a mismanagement within the city, which led to the reason why they're failing in the first place economically. The third thing is probably there is a complacency from the government. For example, the federal government does not want to support possibly these other smaller states within the picture. I think then answering why and how the rights to buy necessarily look like for corporations are two things. The first is probably there is going to be a contract agreement with the particular companies. So possibly it could be up to 10 to 50 or even to 100 years. What I'm proving here is that there's always an ability for you to have a limit between these particular contracts. But the second thing in terms of just how right to govern necessarily looks like, it probably means that these companies have an ability to become somewhat of the state and they have a right for that particular whole area. The last thing I want to note here is why does these companies are actually the best actor at dealing with this particular situation. Notice that this debate and this motion stands plural. So probably with companies or multiple companies coming together, these could probably have private companies who are suitable to actually engage with this particular city and making it into a charter city. Probably looks like San Jose, probably even look like Dubai or Hong Kong within Asia. And this is just to preempt whatever opposition is going to say, right? Necessarily, why do we think companies are still going to be acting in good faith? For two particular reasons. The first is because there's a contract under our side, there's always going to be competition between each of these other companies to necessarily give the best outcome for the particular state. But secondly, we think they're always wanting to maximize profit. So probably looks like efficiency, probably looks like productivity. It acts in both ways. More development means more profit for the companies. More employment means more productivity. Opposition cannot say that they're just bad in entirety. I'll give you two particular arguments under OG. The first is the quality of life for the people on the ground significantly increasing. And I'll give you a second argument on efficiency in terms of the development for this particular charter cities. Next, first argument, the quality of the people for people on the ground. The framing here is that you ought to actually weigh this in the scale of impacts, which means we're going to prove to you the tangible outcomes for the people on the ground, which already proves that our burden is essentially fulfilled. The first thing I want to note here is what are the harms of failing cities to the people on the ground? Two things. The first is the lack of economical opportunity, which is possibly a problem because you always have people on the ground not being able to put food on the table or just have access to things like healthcare, things like welfare, and things like education when you have a failing state. But secondly, and most importantly, is this the lack of development that necessarily happens when you have a failing state. So even if you have money, things like infrastructures would probably be bad. Possibly it looks like roads, like schools, like hospitals that are there possibly, and this is being very charitable to opposition, but it still wouldn't be efficient or sufficient for the people on the ground to actually have the proper access to these particular infrastructures. Why is it that opposition can never solve these particular two problems? The first, and we're being very charitable here, is that these developed cities would always require a huge amount of money for you to actually defend. So probably the alternative under opposition is to have the state to do this, but of course these cities cannot be independent on their own, which means they still have to rely on the federal state or even the smaller state, which means the best case is that at the trade-off, you still cannot develop these particular states at the most efficient and the best way possible. But secondly, and most likely context here, is probably that the state is corrupted in nature. So even with particular money and something that is sufficient, it's unlikely to get development at the point in which there are bureaucracies, there are problems necessarily in just tangibly increasing or boosting the economies of these particular status. But the third thing here is just to note how there's a huge incentive for governments to always pass policies that are populist in nature. So it probably looks like wanting these states to actually fail in order for them to actually win within the particular elections, because that just means they have a lot more of votes. But the last thing I want to note here is that probably these cities are probably just discriminated in nature. Probably these are just the enclaves or just the minorities within this particular state. What I've proven here is that it's very hard for opposition to do this, understanding that the state doesn't necessarily have an incentive to actually solve these particular problems. How do we solve these problems under opening government. I think essentially when companies do take these particular like grants and actually try to develop these particular cities into charter cities, there are two particular important things to note, panel. The first is in terms of resource. So these are the particular companies that are able to inject a lot of money within these particular areas, and they don't necessarily have to care of things like allocations that the state just necessarily do not have. But the second thing is in terms of just the incentives that they have, which is always to increase and maximize profit, which looks like wanting to reduce the cost of operating or wanting a lot of people on the ground to be as educated as possible, because it looks like the workforce essentially being maximized. So necessarily this proves a form of accountability, because they want to reduce this particular cost and probably not want to take people and employers from outside. This means that in order for them to actually prove a form of productivity, there will always be this reason for the companies to actually listen. Why is this beneficial for the people? The first is just in terms of the quality of life just being increased, because understand, panel, the way here is that the mechanization that companies necessarily have is probably like lower taxes, probably like increasing more trades and just lesser and flexible regulations. These are things that would have been politicized under opposition side. At least this mechanization proves a higher point of viability. Before I get to 6, I'll gladly take that POI.
What incentive do these corporations have to provide aged care if those workers won't turn a profit for them?
Okay, I've given you multiple layers, because every little action that they take increases profit. If they necessarily want more employment and they want more productivity within the country, it means a lot of people need to actually give back to the state. Second argument here is just on efficient development. I think it's important to note why this is necessarily true and why these companies are the only ones that can do this. For 3 things. The first is that companies have a lot of expertise in terms of just what probably understanding, that the companies could be multiple, right? I.e., for example, the city has a lot of raw materials, or like Bangladesh, or like fabrics, right? It looks like these companies are always able to shift the focus point to something that is a lot more specified for that state, which means this is the point in which you can actually maximize effectiveness. You're able to actually develop these particular things that would have not been possible by the state because of a lot of scarcity under opposition side. But the second thing to note here is that because they always want efficiency within this particular state, it also looks like increasing sustenance and welfare for the people on the ground, which probably looks like preventing crime rates, for example. Because at the point in which the efficient resource is there, this is the only way that you have a sustainable charter state. And for all those reasons, it has to go to opening government.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. Now calling on Leader of Opposition. Thank you very much for that speech. Now calling on DPI.
Checking my audible.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Give me a sec. I'll take one of your closing. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. OO ran their case with 2 assumptions. Let's take both down. The first assumption is that for some reason, all governments are very good. They never actually take into consideration the reality of in a lot of situations, an economically failing states, more often than not, is because of the fact that the state itself is very corrupted. And the reality is that on that side of the house, for them to just suggest that, we can attract a lot of people to actually come into our country and get a lot of profits. One, there's a lot of problem of corruption where all the money that you are able to attract will still funnel out to the politicians, but never go into the people on the ground. But 2, in a lot of situations, because of politicians just simply not that great as a leader in a lot of situations, they end up just mismanage a lot of the resources, and that's why a lot of these economical failing countries becomes like that. And this is where we see a lot of developing nations face a lot of this problem. In countries such as Malaysia, we also have a lot of problems, especially in cities such as Kelantan, where the government doesn't know how to actually handle the countries properly. In countries such as South Africa, where there's a lot of areas where they do not have proper development because of the fact that the government are simply continuously mismanage the money and also just have a lot of corruption. All of these things prove to you why exactly their assertion about why exactly the government is going to be great, one, cannot actually be credited, but two, and more importantly, does not engage with the reality. Their second assumption in this debate is that for some reason we have going to have a lot of money in order to deal with this. Let's be realistic here. If it is true that you can have a lot of money, therefore this debate cannot even happen to begin with, because of the fact that you already be able to resolve all this economically failing state. I just want to point out that they also did not engage with all the analysis coming from Sarah, because Sarah explains to you that the reasons why a lot of these cities become economically failing is for a lot of reasons. One, it's simply because of the fact that their areas simply just do not have a proper comparative advantage. Two, it's simply because of the fact that the development of that stage has been controlled by a very corrupted people. Or three, it's because of the fact that the federal government literally targeted these specific cities in order to not give them a lot of money, or to ensure that the development is actually impeded for multiple of reasons. Maybe because they are a minority, maybe because they just hate them, maybe because of the geographical or historical reasons that they do not like these people. This happens in a lot of countries. In Burma, like for example in Myanmar, literally certain areas are not being given enough money simply because of the fact that the government simply hate them. In areas such as Malaysia, also like the specific like countries such as state such as like Sabah and Sarawak are not given enough money simply because of the fact that the state simply do not care about them or just simply negligence. What is exactly their response to that? We can use a lot of like other ways. One, they say that we can use like other cities, but the problem is that even if it's true that you can use other cities' money, one, just because you tax other cities' money is not going to be enough, because now you have to use one pool of money in order to cater to two states, which means two cities, which means that you are unlikely to be able to proper have a development on that side of the house. But two, as we explained earlier, because of the corruption, and that means that you're unlikely to do this. But third is because of like the other city also not going to simply give you the money, right? Because they also have their own plan and their own projects, which means that you are unlikely to access this money. Therefore, their first argument as first method of like changes does not work. The second method of changes is actually to use to attract corrupt corporation. One, I just want to point out that they never actually explain to us why exactly corporation will simply believe or like go into your country, especially because of like one, Sarah already explained to you that the corruption means that the money will not funnel to the people, but more importantly is that because of the fact that economically failing state means that there's always like instability. Because of the fact that you do not know how stable this country is, you are less likely to invest in this country because of the fact that you know that they might fail worse in the future, or might you lose a lot of money, which means that there's always a big capital flight in the future. You are less likely to invest money. Why exactly that we're able to attract better investors on our side of the house? Because at the point where like you know there is no involvement of political issue, means that a lot of companies feel more secure when it comes to investing in this country, because they know that every companies just simply want profits, which means that creates a very huge stability for like all of other investors in order to invest in these states or in cities, simply because of the fact that they know that their goals are aligned, which means that they are more likely to actually invest more money into it, and you are able to keep these people. This is the better mechanism that we were able to explain to you. But more importantly, we also tells you that in a lot of situations, because you are a company, that means that you're going to actually have a lot of connection. You're going to have a lot of subsidiary company. You're going to be a multinational companies that actually have a lot of money that can actually bring a lot more people into this state, which means that you're going to have a better way to actually like create changes or like improve the quality of life of these people. That issues alone puts us above OO. Let's deal then with second issue about democracy and accountability. Why exactly democracy just do not work on that side of the house? I just want to point out that one is that because of the fact that you can simply use the populist policy, the fact that a lot of like politicians simply just make sure the people on the ground are poor so that they can give $500 in order for them when it's near the election in order for them to win, which means that democracy simply do not work. But two is because of the rhetoric and the narrative that they always use. I should stay here simply because of the fact that I'm the one who's going to take care of you. I'm the descendant of like the Madiba party. I'm the person who ensures that there will be no communist comes into this country or this city. All of these things is very harmful because like it's very like powerful to upon people do not simply believe in the ability to actually hold them accountable. The third is because of the fact that they're able to scapegoat on all these things. What this proves is that the ability for you to actually hold them accountable simply do not exist even if they have democracy on that side of the house. Before I move on to explain why exactly our accountability mechanism is better, I'll take that POICU.
I think your claim that corporations do good work is misplaced, because if these states are as corrupt as you say, why would they award the contracts for these states to good companies? Why would they not just award it to the highest bidder, the most corrupt company that is willing to pay the most amount of money?
Yeah, that's what we want. We want the biggest bidder. I don't know why you're going with this. Why exactly our accountability mechanism is better? The first reason is because they want to ensure that all of these people are productive. That means that they have to ensure that these people access at the very least education, at the very least healthcare, at the very least some form of food in order for them to be able to actually properly work within this area. Which means that at the very least, this is a huge benefits on our side of the house because we provide some access to equality, some access to a livelihood. On that side of the house, there's no mechanism to get this. Secondly, is the fact that all of these companies have invested and shareholders and they're always under global scrutiny, which means that there's always huge transparency that exists. And more importantly, is that if they do a lot of corrupted and very bad business behavior, what's likely going to happen is that a lot of people will actually hold them accountable internationally because they do not want to actually engage with a business with company that continue abuse people. But third and more importantly is because of the competition between the companies itself, right? Which means that in order for them to actually attract more people into the cities itself, they need to look good. All of these things prove to you why exactly our accountability mechanism is better. But let's assume the worst case scenario. Maybe we have the worst company and maybe they have the best government. At the very least, the tipping point here is that we have enough resources to ensure the better livelihood of these people on that side of the house. They are not able to actually ensure this because on that side of the house, a lot of the money that goes into the city, into the government are more likely to be used for their corruption and goes into their own pocket. On our side of the house, all this money will go into the development of this area, which is why it's far, far better. For these reasons, it is clear. OG.
Much for that speech. To open the closing portion of this debate, member of government.
I'll take POIs in the chat if you have them. Only three things in speech. Firstly, talking about why this results in better economic management of cities. Secondly, in terms of why this results in the government spreading out the resources they divide and give to these people. And then finally, in terms of talking about the opening opposition team. Firstly, in terms of why this benefits the economic policy within these cities, the first part of this is going to be talking about why governments themselves are particularly bad. Noting here, empirically, we think this is true for the reason that given this debate is occurring in places where these cities are economically failing, therefore we necessarily know that the government has been incapable of doing this. I'll get to the part opening opposition's attempt to respond to this in a moment. Then furthermore, we simply think that they do have reasons as to why they would not necessarily care about this, even if they have good incentives to care about the economy overall. Necessarily, there is a way of caring about the economic policy and caring about your voters that doesn't rely on going for these particular cities that are economically failing. And this is for the reason that it by far more increases your tax to focus and invest in big population centers that are already established and already exist, as opposed to ones that are currently failing. It's just much harder to go from negative to positive than further up when you are already doing well. And this explains why they're more likely to invest into big cities that already exist. And notably, as well as this, voting power is just established quite well within these big cities, which means they are likely to care about them far more than the smaller ones that are more likely to be failing and are likely to be losing population as time goes on. So this explains why they don't necessarily have the incentive to care about these people. And noting here that this is a greater set of cases than what our opening government talks about, because they largely talk about places that experience corruption and have governments that have poor incentives. We explain why even if the government has good incentives to benefit the economies of these places, they would still necessarily harm these particular states that we are talking about. So why are these cities going to be managed well by these corporations? A couple of things here. Firstly, we think given that it is such a high cost to buy these places and there's going to be competition to do so, it means they would often be doing loads of research to see if they would be able to do it, if they would be able to do it well. And this reveals that they likely understand that they would do this well. They probably get the best analysis that best people to analyze this as they can, which means that they are well understood as whether or not they are capable of doing this better than the government would be able to. Secondly, they likely they will exist in this place charter city companies. It's not like Amazon is buying these cities. Instead, it's likely to be a new corporation that exists that focuses on turning around cities that are economically failing. And this means that they get particularly good and they hone their skills in terms of doing this kind of economic management. And furthermore, when they do well in one city, it means they can redirect the profits from that to well in other cities and get increasing benefits as a result. So this explains why they're likely to get the best financial analysts because they can pay more because they are a private company. As well as this, it means they are likely to get economies of scale over time when they get really good at doing this and they do it in multiple different countries. Thirdly, they don't want to be messed over by regulation in the future from the government, which means they aren't likely to fuck over civilians like our opening opposition claims. If you hugely reduce working rights and put people into slavery, obviously you're not going to be you're going to get huge amounts of backlash towards the government, which means you're going to be regulated as a company, which means you're unlikely to do that and you're going to err on the side of caution not doing that. Fourthly, necessarily they do just have the interest of people. This is the reason you get the profits from these people from tax. Noting here that this is not Amazon buying a company, it is necessarily a a different corporation that is buying the city and then like doing things so they can get an increase in tax, and where they get their profit is from the tax when that city becomes economically successful. And this explains why opening opposition's response to POI doesn't make sense, because they claim that no, you'll get profit when wages are low. But this explains that where you are getting your profit is off people who have high salaries, off the people who make lots of money, which explains that you necessarily rely on increasing the economic prospects of each individual within this society, and not necessarily being a corporation that then cuts wages by a huge amount, and explains that it is actually in your interest to try and increase the wages of this region. Noting here that when you take over the legislature of a government, you also take over like the tax burdens and the tax benefits you get from it, which explains why it is quite clear that it is in the incentive to help people. Noting here all the things they talk about, things like aged care, things like childcare, are things that increase the benefit and welfare, directly benefit the economic prospects and tax burden that exists on the government. Noting here, when you provide welfare to people, you decrease the tax burden that exists on the state, because it's much more expensive to say deal with a homeless person than to give that person a home directly. That's just the reality of the situation. That explains why economic policy is much better. Noting here, the economy directly impacts every facet of someone's life, which means when you benefit that economy to a significant extent, you also benefit them. Noting here, this is a long-term benefit. When the city then gets handed over back to the state when it does well, or once the lease expires or whatever, this necessarily means you get a huge benefit to these people that live in this state. If you think the economy is like one of the most important points in this debate. Now then, on why you're likely to get more spread out resources in terms of what the government themselves are doing. Noting here, this is even if this exists, even if it is good for the city's economy, even if these strategies, even if these companies are good for the city's economy. This is to say that it looks very bad on a government when you hand over your stake to a company. It shows that you simply were unable to doing good economic management, which means that we are the one that actually creates an incentive that exists in all states, not necessarily swing states like Tim would like to describe to you. Instead, we describe why in all states it is likely to increase the amount that you care about these failing cities, and care about cities that might be on the verge of failing. This explains why you're more likely to then spread out your resources, go from rich and push resources from rich places to poor places. Noting here this response to opening opposition material about the government wanting to abandon these cities and sell them, because it shows that there's a huge amount of backlash you would receive if you sold the city, which means you're likely to invest in trying not to do that. You would invest in trying to not to do that. As well as this explains why you're unlikely to do it to a particularly bad actor, because say if you were selling it to Amazon or whatever, that would look horrendous. Like if Biden tried to sell some city to Amazon, that would look hugely bad on him. So it's unlikely they would engage that, would have some sort of discretion about who exactly they're giving it to. The impact of this overall is that A, this is good for the people who are unable to move out of these failing states, but secondly, it stops the harm of these cities that they are cities that are too bad. This looks like the fact that when you have huge cities, you get huge amounts of environmental harms from urbanization and things like that. And we reduce that when we spread out and have several cities rather than just populating one main city in each state. So this explains why the government is more likely to spread out resources. Noting here, this increases economy, equality within these states. I'll take one from Tim.
Yeah, backlash is the worst mechanism for holding corporations accountable, especially when it's than government regulation, especially when it's unclear that backlash happens anyway when OG sets up these 50 to 100-year contracts.
So the problem is that your government regulation doesn't necessarily exist on your side for the reason, it's unclear why necessarily they should care about these small cities, whether it's our imaging mechanism exists in all cities, necessarily not even just the failing ones themselves that you trying to describe. So furthermore, we explain this increases the equality of these states overall. Finally, in terms of opening opposition, first they talk about how you could redirect money from functioning cities to these areas. Obviously, this is something that would reduce over time and degrade over time because rich cities would fight to reduce their tax burden. Secondly, though, we think they talk about how the government would use this in a bad way to sell them off early. But obviously, you need someone to sell it off, so necessarily they'd want to have prospects. So they wouldn't do this. So this wouldn't actually be true harm in the way that they mechanize. Finally, in terms of the corporations doing this when they see the ability to cut wages and increase tax and things like that. Necessarily, again, we think they get money from taxing these people, so necessarily care about increasing the wages of each individual. As well as this, the government has a discretion over who they give it to. So because of this reason, they're unlikely to give it to people who will be hugely bad for their image as a party and as a politician, which means they aren't likely to do things like the opposition is describing. Obviously, we're not selling some random city in America to Amazon or Apple and allowing them to make a slavery state within it. That seems extraordinarily uncharitable what a rational government would do in the state. For those reasons, clearly vote side government.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now calling on member of
Cool, making sure everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can.
It is not uncharitable to suggest that the kind of cities that would get set up would be in jurisdictions that are pretty weak at enforcing things like rights, would be in jurisdictions and in countries that are easy to pressure into selling these cities to the highest bidder. In fact, empirically, the only places where corporate charter cities have been tried or have even been thought about are places like sub-Saharan Africa, places like Madagascar, places like Latin America, in El Salvador, and in Honduras. So no, we're not selling Cleveland, Ohio to Amazon and having Biden cop the backlash for it. That was the uncharitable characterization. This is about the world's most desperate workers and the world's largest companies and the way that we allow them to be treated and what of recourse we afford them. So 2 contributions then from closing opposition. I'll first extend on the quality of life for people in these cities because I do not think opening opposition conceptualizes just how bad it will be. And secondly, I will explain how this affects companies' behavior and the way that they export their negative externalities onto the rest of the world in the form of tax, in the form of trade and development, in the form of anti-competitive behavior. Let's start with quality of life. A couple of observations about the way that charter cities work and the way that companies engage with them. The first observation that hasn't been made thus far in this debate is that charter cities get to entirely control their immigration policies, the visas that they issue, the citizenships that they issue. So the reason that Hong Kong can kick you out without anything going on in mainland China, because they have control over their own immigration, they have their own passport stamps, their own citizenship proceedings. The second observation is that they get to entirely control people's dispute resolutions, the judiciary, and their rights. They get to do things like appoint local judges. They control all local laws, and that companies broadly act to minimize liability. So I don't think this is a debate about whether or not we provide, purely a debate about whether or not we provide aged care at all. I think it's also a debate about whether we say kick people out of their homes because they are not productive workers and are not employed by the company that runs that charter city. About whether we strip people of their right to privacy and surveil them not around the clock like Amazon does in its own factories times 100, because it is not subject to anybody's will or anybody's law but its own. In that instance, that is the kind of life that awaits these people. They get kicked out of their homes. They do not get access to or they are unable to enter these cities for the economic opportunities if they are not the kind of bill that these kind of companies are looking for. And so the economic benefits to those people are minimal. The economic benefits to people outside of those cities is even less than that. Let's secondly explain why companies' behavior is particularly bad and why there are a bunch of harms caused outside of those charter cities because of it. Charter cities will absolutely give companies carte blanche to do whatever they want for a couple of reasons. The first that we identify is that they get to set the terms. The only kind of material we get to this on government bench is that, well, there are competition between companies for these contracts because they obviously would be very lucrative with the amount of control that you can get. But I'd make a couple of responses. The first is that there are also many failing cities globally who presumably could benefit, whose governments presumably could benefit from the cash injection that this causes. So actually there is an additional race to the bottom there with the cities promising the most lax terms for the lowest comparative price. And there's secondly actually relatively few global firms that can afford to do this. It is not the case as closing governments suggest that there would be new companies set up to do these charter cities. Like it is obviously going to be Apple. It is obviously going to be Amazon. It is obviously going to be the companies that do hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue every year, whose annual revenue already eclipses the GDP of many smaller states. And secondly, we explained that the states that you're buying off of are relatively desperate. So what happens to this group of these sets of cities then? Most of the world's largest companies buy themselves a city, headquarter and incorporate there, and avoid all sorts of accountability. Right now, they're likely to stay somewhat within reach because they need a state that within the reach of kind of laws and formations of laws and states, because they need a state that has favorable regulations and enforcement only because they cannot make it on a wide scale themselves. They can't make the rules in which they're incorporated that govern their company's constitution. They can't always make the frameworks that dictate how much corporate tax they are to be charged. So they accept that they should headquarter themselves in somewhere like Dubai or like the UAE, or more frequently in places like London or or the United States. What they do now is they headquarter themselves in these cities, and they engage in as much of their corporate activity as possible from there. That has a few implications. The first is they will stop paying large amounts of corporate tax. They already don't pay enough, but they do pay some, basically everywhere else, which harms every country that has to rely on that tax revenue for its own functions, and I would note did not benefit from or consent to the sale of that city and the chain of events that were set in place. That impacts their ability to do welfare, impacts their ability to do investment in their own state, and to insulate themselves, in fact, from the negative externalities of corporate behavior within their jurisdictions. Secondly, companies are able to do this in ways that states can't avoid, because the kind of companies that can afford to do this are ones that have global systemic importance. It is things like incredibly large infrastructure firms. It is things like Amazon that do an enormous amount of package delivery and shipping enterprises the world over. So they cannot avoid that there. Any one government that tries to do something is at an obvious disadvantage. Second thing that they will do is they will engage in a lot of anti-competitive behavior within their own industry, because they will not let other competitors into their cities in a way that threatens them. And just like sense check this for a second, you've just shelled out an enormous amount of money to buy a city and insulate yourself from the law and from regulations, and you're going to let a bunch of other companies that compete with you in and they have the capacity to do this because they both create the charter and enforce it. So they can do, maybe they can't write into their charter, we will ban other companies, but they can do things like refuse to approve the project proposals of companies that apply to break ground on a new factory. OG, go ahead.
People on the ground are dying because the lack of access to livelihood, things such as healthcare, things such as education, things such as food. On your side of the house, you have no ability to actually ensure these people are able to access these things. At the very least, be able to achieve something.
Guys, okay, this is respond to OO if you want to respond to OO. What we tell you is that instead, not only will they not provide healthcare, they will also deport anyone with a disability because they do not want to have to look after them and can fully control immigration over that. You do not get a benefit to these people. You have not proved it in 3 speakers on your bench. Third thing that they will do is they will do irresponsible and inefficient investment. Currently, there is actually some rhyme or reason as to where people set up their companies. For instance, they set up in manufacturing states that have good manufacturing hubs. They set up in places like Shanghai or in Hong Kong because of the high amount of intellectualized workers there. And when you do this, you drain investment domestically, but also internationally away from those existing hubs. It's unclear to me why the citizens of any one small failing city matter more than, say, the citizens of Yogyakarta, which is a massive manufacturing hub that Indonesia would not be willing to sell, would get all of its investment drained away from it there, which just causes a cascade of harms to other countries, to the global economy. They never wanted any part of this. They deserved the right to be able to govern corporations that operated within their borders, that were headquartered there and were incorporated there. This stripped them of that right. You did not get any benefits to people in those places. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now calling on government.
Just checking I'm audible. Sorry, am I able to be heard? Oh, yeah, okay, cool. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is explain why our extension wins us this debate and why it weighs over our opening, and then I will explain why we win over the opposition bench. Let's start with the extension though, because we provide 2 important positive contributions to this debate that explain why conclusively these corporate chartered cities are an enormous benefit. The first is just the governments often perversely pursue policies that prioritize larger cities, which is what causes the smaller cities that tend to economically fail, the ones that we're talking about in this debate, to lose the economic opportunities that result in them being these failing cities in the first place. That results in all of the harms of megacities that result in a poorer quality of living for everyone who is involved, because governments are often tended to prioritize just the city, as Will explains, just the city that has the most international attention and the most international backlash if something were to go wrong, or just prioritize the city in which its parliament and things like that are built, which means that the governments are likely to prioritize the development of megacities and lose out all of the regional cities where this debate is likely to take place. But it also means for all of the people that are unable to get out of these regional cities, or people that are unable, like who do not have the economic prospects to do so, that they lose all of the ability to provide for themselves and to create these economic prospects for themselves, because the government pursues a policy which puts all the trade deals that they pursue in these major cities. And this is why these cities fail in the first place. So what our extension explains is that we are the first team to actually try and explain why you're less likely to get these cities economically failing in the first place, because the governments are now more likely to pursue policies that distribute the resources amongst a number of cities, instead of concentrating their wealth in one and creating these economically failing cities in another, which is an enormous positive contribution to the debate, as I will wait in a second. Because we are the first team to explain why you are actually likely to get less of these economically failing cities in the first place. And that is a huge benefit, because it sidesteps all of the harms that the opposition bench wants to talk about. They never accrue in the first place if these cities never start failing. But we also provide a variety of additional mechanization that our opening misses to explain why these corporations are likely to be good actors that is directly responsive to the opposition bench. We explain why these corporations have the unique capacity to do the research and optimize how they are able to run these cities, so they can self-select into the cities that they are likely to be able to run well and do not bid for contracts so they are not. We explain these corporations are likely to make money off of the tax, are able to make money off of the taxes from people within these cities, so they want to reduce the burden on these people to pay for things like their own aged care or their own childcare, which, as Will points out, responds to opening opposition and deletes a vast majority of their material that suggests that you might not be able to access essential services. Because we explain that it is far more likely that what these corporations have an incentive to do is to do things in a way that allows them to maximize their taxes off of individual people, which is to provide for them and provide economic prospects in a way that is particularly supportive of these people, so that they are able to reap the most benefit. But we do also just explain that it is likely to be companies with the most liquid capital, which whether or not you believe it is likely that these charter companies who make profit by flipping cities around in order to produce some instrument economic surplus would also look like things like venture capital funds that have far more liquid capital than production companies like Apple and Amazon that have to reinvest the vast majority of their profits, because they need to continue producing goods in order to support their business model. Means that you are likely to get companies that do not create the hellscape that CO wants to talk about. These are the kind of companies that are likely to exist in the debate. 4 reasons why this weighs over our opening. Firstly, OG manages to identify that governments often cause the mismanagement that leads to economic failure, but they fail to identify why their behavior is likely to change. And it is CG that provides by far the most important impact in this debate because of that logic, because we explain why these governments are likely to change the ways that they act in the first place, instead of just waiting until everything goes to shit and then not knowing how to manage in these economic crises. Secondly, they only deal with a subset of an extreme subset of cases where governments are maliciously corrupt or discriminatory. But we deal with a much broader scope where governments follow models of economic thought that cause them to prioritize the development of megacities and neglect regional cities that tend to fail in the prospect, which is a far larger amount of cities, which explains why our material is able to function in a much wider set of issues of cities in this debate. That should already explain why we have a far more important positive contribution. Thirdly, we explain a preventative measure whereas they are only able to respond to crises. We explain why we're able to prevent them in the first place, which avoids the enormous amount of harms the opposition wants to talk about. But fourthly, I would just say that we provide far more specific mechanization as to why these corporations are likely to do things well through all the mechanization in Will's speech, some of which I have repeated, some of which I think is still standing after that at the end of this debate, that should explain to you why we are more conclusively able to prove that these corporations would both have the capacity to manage these cities well, but would also have incentives, and why governments would have incentives to do these things particularly well as well. Let's move on to explain why this extension knocks OO out of the debate. The first thing we do is we explain a few key ways in which companies are likely to manage these far better than governments were able to. Before I go on, I'm happy to take a POI from OO.
Yeah, in your best case, when governments do this policy well and the policy is preferable for people on the ground, why can't governments just set up charter cities where they can prevent the worst harms Op Bench explains?
because these kind of charter cities are likely to still have all of the problems that we described, where you don't have corporations coming in and running it, which is in the case where governments have mismanaged badly because they are unable to do things like to a sufficient extent where these countries, like where these cities can actually function. It is deeply unclear to me why having a charter city would fix this. You would clearly need to have like a transfer of governance, so that people who do actually have the research and do actually have the expertise to be able to run these cities and have the capital to be able to do so will be able to start up. And we also identified that it's a completely different set of corporations that we're talking about. Like the kind of corporations that can provide the best kinds of care are not the kinds of corporations that would be able to enter into charter cities in your world. So that should explain why that POI, that POI should actually explain another conclusive reason why we're able to weigh over you. But I would also just say that we already explained why these companies are able to make profits off of their tax. So we want people in these cities to be economically viable, which explains why the OO material about cutting services and things just falls out of this debate. But we also explain why governments choose well for the reasons that they don't want to look terrible. And maybe you don't care. Maybe it is true that they might not care how they look to their populations, but they definitely care how they look. They care about how they look to their populations because of voting, like the fact they need to get voted back in and stuff. But they also care on an international level because it's how they're able to maintain their legitimacy and do things like retain their power into the long term. And we would say that we are far better able to provide a preventative measure why these cities are less likely to fail in the first place. So the thing to point out with CO is just to consider the comparative, which is maybe like if these countries are so bad, they would give these contracts to the kinds of hellish corporations that CO describes. It is deeply unclear to me why their alternative of having the governments continue to run these kind of cities would be any better, because clearly these corporations, if they were to lease them out in the kind of hellscape that CO describes, would just do an equally terrible job, maybe are equally likely to have terrible deportation measures. And that's why our extension that explains unique incentives of corporations to do things particularly well is why we're able to conclusively win over CO.
Thank you for that speech. Now calling on close the debate up with.
I'll take POIs in the chat. You go negotiate favorable terms so we don't get kicked out of the room. Okay. I'm going to start this speech by asking the question of under what kinds of terms are cities likely to get sold? And the reason that I'm starting here is because every single other team in this debate and all their extensions flow from whether the state and that corporation are likely to act in good conscience and actually want to work well on behalf of those citizens. So what sorts of cities are actually likely to be sold in? Are they likely to be, is this likely to be happening in good states? The simple answer that seems to be accepted by both sides in this debate is that no. The reason that cities fail is because they are subject to things like corruption. They're subject to poor resource endowment. They're subject to things like mismanagement. And on the converse, well-off cities tend to be ones that are not corrupt and therefore don't need to have these sorts of measures instituted onto them. For this reason, the POI that we give to you at OG is one that is particularly damning and one that the DLO is actually derivative of us from, because we explain to you in a POI that states that are likely to be very corrupt are also then likely to award these contracts to the highest bidder. That is to say the person that has the worst, that is to say the person that is likely to pay the most amount of money, and therefore the person that is likely to therefore abuse these workers and abuse the rules of those things to the greatest extent, right? Because the highest bidder needs to have lax rules to justify the high price that they paid. So what happens is you get really terrible buyers buying these sorts of things. And to that extent, all of GovBench is knocked out in this debate, because we've explained to you that to the extent that these terms are ones that are particularly heinous, then you cannot have good things like, an incentive to invest in the education of these people, because it's simply cheaper for you to do things like, fly in workers, from other countries to come into your city, as opposed to have to invest in, entire education system overhauls. It's far cheaper and far more guaranteed for you to want to access those really cheap, quick fixes than for you to actually invest in the human capital of that city. So if there is really unfavorable terms, that means that we knock all of the rest of this government bench out of the debate. The claims that we hear from CG is that actually it's not going to be really bad. It's not going to be really bad corporations investing in really large megacities. It's going to be happening in smaller cities, and it'll tend to be startups. Firstly, on the startups thing, why would smaller corporations that they want to talk about actually even have the capital to outcompete really large corporations in this space? They just don't have the money to outcompete people like Amazon and Microsoft and like Google in these sorts of things. Why on earth would they be able to do that to a greater extent than another place? But secondly, why is it even desirable for you to go into a smaller city, right? Because those small cities that they want to talk about, the ones that have not failed yet, firstly, that's out of the debate because they haven't failed yet. But secondly, they have smaller populations, they have less space, they have lower educational attainment. Those are things that are unattractive for you to want to actually invest in that city in the very first instance. Those are sorts of places that you are very unlikely to be bad. But finally, they don't even prove at CG why this is why this is even a benefit to have those sort of cities get that in the first place. Surely you ought to prioritize the mega cities anyway. They say that our characterization of it being terrible corporations is one that is uncharitable and that we have to prove that the government is better. Literally untrue, because if we prove that a corporation is sufficiently bad, then we don't need to prove that the government is better because that corporation is simply worse. Maybe on the outside, it is better for the government to be the person that steps in, because people then will naturally move away from that city and move into other economically rich areas in favor of better living conditions. They won't actually step out there. So now that GovBench is out of the debate because we've proven that these terms are unfavorable at CO, I'm now going to spend the vast majority of this speech then talking about why these sorts of charter cities are really conducive to poor corporate behavior. And let's step out what the contribution of OO is, of what OO is in this debate, on this question of poor corporate behavior, because I think that it is quite limited. Because OO makes a series of claims here, that is to say that, the terms of that charter city's governance are ones that are likely to be conducive to worker exploitation and environmental harm. But our claim here goes far further than theirs, because we not only explain that these terms are likely to be bad for a unique set of reasons, we also explain to you that these corporations are likely to go beyond the simple rules in the governance of these cities and act in ways that bend those things and act in ways that make those outcomes far worse. We explain that corporations are likely to abuse those rules, not the rules that they've set, not just do the things that the OO wants to talk about here, which is follow the rules that that they set initially, talking about that in initial negotiation stage. So what are the set of things that we tell you are unique under side CO? We firstly tell you that these corporations are likely to be incredibly happy to edit these laws, or happy to sort of twist the rules of the governance which they have created in the first place. This looks like the loose interpretation of regulations for the environment. It also looks like them slowly changing tax breaks, right? Because for example, if you do things like hugely reduced tax breaks, as Conna explains to you, that is something that is firstly within the scope of those companies to do at the very first instance, but also this is something that's incredibly devastating for that country writ large, because this is a huge hit to government revenue in those states, right? Because if now Amazon is moving to some random country in Africa, as opposed to paying tax on all of the corporations that they previously had, if they operationalize everything within that one city and have really lax tax breaks, that is a huge drain of money from those places. This is particularly important for corporations operating in states that are of a lower development, because of the fact that oftentimes these corporations in developing countries are the only major source of tax income, because they are the only actor within that state that actually has a lot of money and can contribute significant amounts to the tax pool. Note that individuals of low income aren't policed for their tax and don't even have the ability to pay large amounts of tax at the very first instance. That was the sort of thing that meant that this was a huge hit if you weren't unable to collect corporate revenue. Secondly, we tell you that this leads to anti-competitive behavior, because you can do things like lock other companies out. This has huge downstream impacts. You no longer get things like good consumer products. You get them to be of crappy quality, and you get them to be incredibly expensive, because you can lock other people out of the market and hog market share. Before I talk about the final thing, I will take OG.
On your side of the house, if the corporation is really want to destroy the environment and also abuse all these workers will revolt against them and their business model will not be sustainable for 50 years, which is why
Okay.
they do not have an
I don't think
incentive
it's
to do
likely that
this.
workers are going to revolt against MNCs for the simple reason that our MNCs have a huge amount of power and coercion over a person because they literally control that person's like wages. Why haven't Amazon workers in America revolted against the Amazon company there? I think that's just an implausible claim. The fine thing that we tell you is that under our side, you take away far more efficient forms of investment because corporations forego places that have a comparative advantage in certain areas in favor of going for a city that is really cheap for them to operate in. And in the long term, this hurts the ability of those corporations to produce consumer products. This is a debate-winning claim for two reasons. Firstly, because as I explained earlier, it is entirely independent of whether the terms of that corporate charter are actually good in the first place. We tell you these corporations are likely to bend the rules no matter what. But secondly, we tell you that we affect a far greater amount of people than all the other teams in the space who merely focus on a small city. We focus on the whole world who consumes these products for a far greater price and for a far lower quality. We're now stripped of the ability to actually do things and spend money on things that they want and things that they need to be able to do. We affect a huge amount of people, not just a couple of 100,000 living in there. In terms of then why this hurts the citizens of those individual cities, CG says that this leads to people caring about these cities more at the very first instance. But I'll just point to you what Conna said, which is that obviously this debate does not take, obviously maybe it's looked bad for Biden to be selling cities, but it doesn't look bad for Bukele to be selling cities because obviously it depends on the sort of jurisdiction that you're in. Bukele is much more than happy to do these sorts of things. This sort of mechanism in terms of accountability from the external only applies to countries where these cities are not likely to be purchased in the very first place. Countries like America. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Hello, so sorry, we have to leave immediately because security will kick us out. Thanks for everyone for the debate.
Real, that's us as well. So thanks everyone.
Hi, sorry, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Could I please redact? I just realized I vaped while someone was asking a POI.